The emergency council meeting had lasted 14 hours, and still nobody had answers. Elder Thoric rubbed his massive paws against his temples, feeling every one of his 300 years weighing on his shoulders. Around the circular chamber, the other elders of the Althean Confederacy sat in defeated silence, their golden manes dulled with worry. The problem was simple to understand, but impossible to solve. 6 cubs, the last of their generation, refused to bond with any Althean guardian. Without bonding, they would never develop the higher brain functions that separated civilized Altheans from their feral ancestors. The cubs would remain wild, unable to speak, unable to learn, unable to carry on their species' legacy of wisdom and strength. Elder Marin, the oldest among them, spoke first. Her voice carried the weight of ancient tradition. "We have tried every bloodline, every proven guardian, every ritual our ancestors practiced for thousands of years. The cubs reject them all." It was true. The 6 cubs, ranging in age from barely walking to adolescent, had been presented with dozens of potential guardians over the past month. Each time the same result: snarling, clawing, complete rejection. The cubs seemed determined to remain feral rather than accept any Althean as their guide into civilized life. "Perhaps," Elder Kane suggested hesitantly, "we should consider that this generation is simply lost. We could focus our resources on the next breeding cycle." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone knew there would be no next breeding cycle if this one failed. The Althean population had been declining for centuries. These 6 cubs represented the last hope for their species' survival. Elder Thoric stood slowly, his joints creaking. At 8 feet tall, he dominated the chamber even among his fellow giants. "There is one option we have not discussed." The other elders turned toward him with curious expressions. Thoric had always been the most traditional among them, the one who insisted on following the ancient ways. If he had a new suggestion, it must be desperate indeed. The human merchant who docked yesterday. Bennett, I believe his name was. He completed his supply run and was preparing to leave when I observed something unusual. Thoric activated the chamber's display screen. Grainy security footage showed the station's main corridor. A human male, average height for his species, with graying hair and weather-worn features, walked past the observation window of the cubs' holding area. The 6 young Altheans, who had been pacing and snarling all day, suddenly went quiet. They pressed against the transparent barrier, watching the human with intense curiosity rather than the usual hostility. This behavior lasted for several minutes. Thoric continued. "The cubs showed more interest in this alien than in any of our own people." Elder Marin's golden eyes widened with shock. "You cannot be suggesting what I think you are suggesting." "I am suggesting exactly that." Thoric's voice carried grim determination. "We give the cubs to the human, as a trial." The chamber erupted in protests. Voices rose in outrage, speaking of honor, tradition, the sanctity of Althean bloodlines. Elder Kane slammed his massive fist on the stone table, creating a crack that ran its entire length. "Absolutely not. No alien has ever successfully bonded with our young. It would be cultural contamination of the highest order." "And what culture will remain if we let these cubs die feral?" Thoric shot back. "What traditions will we preserve if our species becomes extinct?" The argument continued for hours. Some elders cited ancient texts forbidding alien contact with unbonded cubs. Others worried about the political implications if word spread to the other Althean colonies. The humans were traders and explorers, not caregivers. They had their own young to worry about. But as the debate raged, the facts remained unchanged. The cubs were dying, not physically, but mentally. Each day they remained unbonded. Their window for proper development closed a little more. Soon, it would be too late for any guardian, Althean or otherwise, to help them. Finally, Elder Thoric called for silence. "The human ship is scheduled to depart in 6 hours. If we are going to act, it must be now. I propose a formal vote." The voting. Crystals appeared on the table before each elder. 7 total, representing the 7 great houses of the Althean Confederacy. The decision required a simple majority. One by one, the crystals lit up. 3 red for rejection, 3 blue for approval. Elder Thoric's crystal remained dark as the deciding vote. He thought of his own cubs, lost in a pirate raid decades ago. He thought of empty nurseries across Althean space, of schools closing for lack of students, of a proud civilization slowly fading into memory. Then he touched his crystal. Blue light filled the chamber. The walk to the docking bay felt like a funeral march. Elder Thoric led a small procession of guards carrying secured transport containers. Inside each container, a confused and frightened cub waited in chemically induced sleep. It was the only way to move them safely without risking injury to the handlers. Roy Bennett stood beside his cargo freighter, checking manifest data on his tablet. He was a simple man making a simple living hauling supplies between the outer colonies. The Altheans paid well for medical equipment and food synthesizers, and their station served as a useful waypoint for ships traveling the outer rim. He looked up as the strange procession approached. The lead Althean stood at least 3 feet, taller than him, with the dignified bearing of someone important. Bennett had learned enough about their culture to recognize an elder by the intricate braiding in his golden mane. "Mr. Bennett," Thoric began formally, "I am Elder Thoric of the 7th House. I have an unusual request." Bennett set down his tablet and gave the elder his full attention. In his 20 years of trading, he had learned that unusual requests from alien dignitaries usually meant unusual profits. "I'm listening." Thoric gestured to the transport containers. "These contain 6 cubs of our species. They are unbonded and difficult. We would like you to take custody of them for 1 standard month." Bennett blinked in surprise. He had expected a request for emergency transport or perhaps black market goods. "Not babysitting duty. I don't know anything about raising Althean children," he said carefully. "Neither, it seems, do we." The admission clearly pained the proud elder. "These cubs have rejected every traditional guardian. They face a fate worse than death if they remain unbonded. We observed their reaction to you yesterday. It was encouraging." Bennett thought about his empty cargo hold, his planned route to the mining colonies of the Vega system, his simple life that involved nobody but himself. Then he looked at the transport containers and wondered what kind of desperation would drive a species as proud as the Altheans to ask for help from a human. What exactly would I need to do? Keep them alive. Keep them safe. If they bond with you, we will know within the month. If not, Thoric shrugged, a gesture that seemed to contain all the grief of a dying civilization. Bennett looked at his ship, then at the containers, then at the elder, whose golden eyes held more hope than he probably realized. "All right," he said finally. "I'll try." As the transport containers were loaded into his cargo bay, Bennett wondered what he had just agreed to. He was about to find out that some decisions change not just your own life, but the course of history itself. Roy Bennett had made a lot of mistakes in his 52 years, but as he stared at the chaos in his cargo bay, he wondered if this might be his biggest one yet. The 6 Althean cubs were awake now, and they were not happy about their new accommodations. Katintir, largest cub, probably close to adolescence, paced back and forth like a caged animal. His golden fur was already developing the thick mane that would mark him as an adult male. Every few minutes, he would charge at the reinforced barriers Bennett had hastily constructed, testing for weaknesses with the persistence of a born tactician. The smallest cub, a female barely the size of a house cat, had found a corner and refused to move. She watched everything with bright green eyes that seemed too intelligent for her tiny body. Bennett had started thinking of her as Pip, though he had no idea if Altheans even used individual names for their young. The other 4 cubs fell somewhere between these extremes. 2 were busy destroying everything they could reach, tearing apart supply crates with claws designed for hunting. Another seemed to be conducting some kind of experiment, carefully observing how different materials reacted to various types of damage. The last cub simply sat and stared at Bennett with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Bennett's first instinct had been to establish dominance, the way he had seen Althean adults interact with their young. He had stood tall, made himself look bigger, and used the few Althean words he knew to command respect. The cubs had responded by completely ignoring him. His second attempt involved offering food. He had purchased specialized Althean nutrition blocks from the station, expensive supplements designed for growing cubs. The cubs had examined the blocks carefully, then used them as projectiles to express their opinion of both the food and their new guardian. By the third day, Bennett was exhausted. He had barely slept, afraid that the cubs would hurt themselves or damage something vital to the ship's operation. His cargo bay looked like a war zone, and he was starting to understand why the Altheans had been so desperate. That evening, as he sat on the floor trying to clean claw marks out of his jacket, Bennett made a decision that would change everything. He stopped trying to be an Althean guardian and decided to be himself instead. The next morning, instead of entering the cargo bay with commands and demands for respect, Bennett simply sat down near the barriers and began his daily routine. He ate his breakfast, checked his messages, and reviewed his navigation charts. The cubs watched him warily but without the immediate hostility they had shown before. After finishing his meal, Bennett began talking. Not giving orders or trying to teach them anything, just talking the way he would to any companion on a long journey. "We're about 3 days out from the Proxima system," he said conversationally. "Nice planets there. One of them has oceans that stretch from horizon to horizon. The water is so blue it looks like liquid sky." The cubs tilted their heads, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of casual conversation. None of them had ever heard an adult speak without purpose, without trying to teach or command or correct. Bennett continued talking as he worked, describing star systems and trade routes, telling stories about interesting people he had met and strange customs he had observed. Gradually, the cubs began to relax. The constant pacing stopped. The destructive behavior decreased. Even the largest cub began spending more time listening than testing the barriers. On the 5th day, something remarkable happened. Pip, the smallest cub, began making soft chirping sounds when Bennett talked. It took him a while to realize she was trying to respond, to participate in the conversation even though she had no words yet. Bennett began talking directly to her, asking questions he knew she couldn't answer, but treating her responses as if they made perfect sense. "Oh, you think the blue planets are interesting too? Have you ever seen water before?" "No, I suppose you haven't." "Well, maybe someday we'll visit one together." The other cubs began paying attention to these conversations. They started making their own sounds, different for each individual. Bennett began to recognize patterns, to understand that they were developing a primitive form of communication, specifically for interacting with him. By the end of the first week, the cubs had stopped trying to escape. They would gather near the barriers when Bennett entered, eager for the daily conversations that had become the highlight of their confined existence. They began eating the nutrition blocks, not because they had been commanded to, but because they had observed Bennett eating and wanted to share the experience. The real breakthrough came on day 8. Pip had been making increasingly complex sounds, trying to imitate the patterns of Bennett's speech. During their morning conversation, she managed something that sounded almost like Ben, a shortened version of his name. Bennett's reaction was immediate and emotional. He smiled wider than he had in years and praised her effort with genuine enthusiasm. "That's right, Pip. I'm Ben. You're such a smart girl." The response from the other cubs was electric. They had never seen an adult react with such joy to a youngling's achievement. In Althean society, successful learning was expected, not celebrated. This display of genuine happiness over a small accomplishment was completely alien to their experience. The largest cub, who Bennett had started calling Max due to his size, began making deliberate attempts at communication. Within days, all 6 cubs were producing recognizable approximations of simple words. Their progress was remarkable, far exceeding the normal development timeline for their species. But the real change was in their behavior. They began seeking Bennett's approval, not out of fear or duty, but because his positive reactions made them happy. When they accomplished something difficult, they would look to him expectantly, waiting for the praise that had become so important to them. Bennett found himself falling into natural parenting behaviors he hadn't used since his own children were young. He celebrated their successes, comforted them when they were frustrated, and gradually introduced simple rules and expectations. The cubs responded to this approach with eager cooperation. The turning point came during the second week, when Pip fell ill with a common Althean childhood condition. Her temperature spiked and she began showing signs of serious distress. According to the medical files Elder Thoric had provided, standard Althean practice was to isolate sick cubs to prevent infection and allow them to recover independently. Bennett ignored the protocol completely. Instead, he moved his sleeping area into the cargo bay and stayed with Pip around the clock. He monitored her temperature, offered her water frequently, and maintained gentle physical contact to comfort her. When she cried, he soothed her with soft words and gentle touches. The other cubs watched this display with fascination. They had never seen an adult prioritize a sick youngling's emotional needs over practical concerns. When Pip's fever broke, on the third day, all 6 cubs had witnessed something that would fundamentally change their understanding of what it meant to be cared for. By the end of the second week, Bennett realized that something unprecedented was happening. The cubs weren't just learning to communicate with him. They were bonding with him in ways that seemed to exceed normal Althean development. They had become a cohesive group with him at the center, not as a dominating authority figure, but as a trusted protector and guide. Elder Thoric's monitoring equipment hidden throughout the cargo bay recorded stress hormone levels in the cubs that were lower than any previously measured in their species. The cubs were not just surviving under human care, they were thriving in ways that Althean science had never documented. But Bennett knew nothing about the monitoring equipment or the scientific implications of what was happening. He only knew that 6 frightened, angry cubs had become 6 curious, affectionate young beings who rushed to greet him each morning and settled peacefully when he wished them good night. As the third week began, Bennett found himself dreading the approaching deadline. The cubs had become his family, and he had become theirs in ways that transcended species boundaries. Whatever the elders decided at the end of the trial period, Bennett knew his life would never be the same. The emergency klaxons screaming throughout Bennett's ship shattered the peaceful morning routine he had established with the cubs. Red warning lights bathed the cargo bay in pulsing crimson as the automated voice announced what every spacer dreaded to hear. Hull breach detected. Atmospheric containment compromised. All personnel to emergency stations. Bennett's blood turned to ice. A hull breach in deep space was often a death sentence, especially on an aging cargo freighter like his. He had perhaps minutes before the ship's atmosphere bled away into the void, taking all of them with it. His first instinct was to run to the bridge and assess the damage. The emergency protocols were clear, and he had drilled them countless times. But as he turned toward the exit, he realized he faced an impossible choice. The cubs couldn't survive in the vacuum of space, and the cargo bay had no independent life support systems. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists for generations to come. Max, the largest cub, suddenly stood and began making a series of complex vocalizations. They weren't the simple words he had been learning, but something deeper, more primal. The other cubs responded immediately, moving with purpose and coordination that Bennett had never seen before. Pip, despite being the smallest, seemed to understand the ship's layout better than should have been possible. She led 2 of the other cubs to the emergency supply lockers, chirping instructions in rapid Althean that somehow the others comprehended perfectly. They began retrieving emergency oxygen masks and portable atmosphere generators with the efficiency of trained crew members. Meanwhile, the 2 remaining cubs had positioned themselves at the cargo bay's primary access points. They weren't guarding the exits, Bennett realized. They were guarding him, ensuring that he couldn't leave them behind in his instinct to save himself. Max approached Bennett directly and began a series of gestures and vocalizations that conveyed unmistakable meaning. The cubs knew about the emergency. They understood the danger, and they had no intention of letting their human guardian face it alone. Bennett stared in amazement as the 6 cubs, none of them more than a few months old, organized themselves into what could only be described as a tactical unit. Their movements were precise, purposeful, and based on knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. "How do you know what to do?" Bennett whispered, but there was no time for answers. The ship shuddered, as another section of hull gave way. The atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly, and Bennett could hear the high-pitched whistle of escaping air. He had to get to the bridge to activate emergency systems, but the Cubs were clearly not going to let him go alone. Max solved the dilemma by grabbing Bennett's arm with surprising gentleness and leading him toward the exit. The other Cubs fell into formation around them, creating a protective barrier that would have impressed military strategists. Pip took point, somehow knowing the safest route through the ship's corridors. 2 Cubs flanked Bennett on either side, while the remaining 2 brought up the rear, constantly scanning for threats. They moved through the ship like a unit that had trained together for years, not a group of infants who had never left the cargo bay before. The Cubs anticipated obstacles, communicated silently with subtle gestures, and adapted to changing conditions with remarkable intelligence. When they reached the bridge, Bennett threw himself into the pilot's seat and began emergency diagnostics. The situation was worse than he had feared. Multiple micrometeorites had punctured the hull in a cluster pattern, creating a cascade failure in the atmospheric systems. He had maybe 10 minutes before life support failed completely. The Cubs spread out across the bridge, each taking position at a different station. Bennett expected them to be frightened by the unfamiliar environment, but instead they seemed fascinated by the various displays and controls. Pip climbed up to the communications station and began examining the interface with intense curiosity. "No, sweetheart, don't touch anything," Bennett said automatically as he worked to reroute power to the emergency systems. But Pip was already manipulating the controls with surprising dexterity. To Bennett's amazement, she activated the distress beacon and began broadcasting their location on all standard emergency frequencies. Somehow, this tiny cub who had never seen a communications array before understood exactly how to operate it. Max had positioned himself at the navigation station and was studying the star charts with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. When Bennett glanced over, he was shocked to see that the Cub had identified their exact position and was highlighting nearby stations that might offer assistance. The other Cubs had distributed themselves at environmental controls, sensor arrays, and power management stations. They weren't operating the equipment, but they were watching, learning, and occasionally making soft sounds that Bennett was beginning to recognize as suggestions or observations. The emergency repairs took 3 hours of intensive work. Bennett had to EVA twice to patch the hull breaches manually, leaving the Cubs alone on the bridge. When he returned from the second spacewalk, exhausted and running on adrenaline, he found them arranged in a defensive circle around the pilot's seat, as if protecting his position until he could return. But the most remarkable moment came as they prepared to resume course. Bennett was running final diagnostics when Pip suddenly made an urgent chirping sound and pointed at one of the displays. The navigation computer was showing a minor course correction that would take them dangerously close to an asteroid field. Bennett double-checked the calculations and realized she was right. The emergency repairs had affected their trajectory in ways the automated systems hadn't fully compensated for. Without her intervention, they would have flown directly into a debris field that could have destroyed the ship. "How did you know?" Bennett asked softly, looking into Pip's bright green eyes. She couldn't answer in words, but her expression conveyed something that made Bennett's breath catch. These Cubs weren't just learning from him. They were learning from everything around them, absorbing information and developing understanding at a rate that defied explanation. As the ship settled back into normal operations, the Cubs gradually relaxed their vigilant postures. But something fundamental had changed. They had gone from being dependent youngsters to active partners in survival. They had demonstrated intelligence, loyalty, and protective instincts that exceeded anything in the Althean developmental records. That evening, as Bennett sat in the cargo bay reflecting on the day's events, he realized that the Cubs had chosen him as completely as he had chosen them. They weren't just bonding with him. They were bonding as a family unit with him at the center. Max approached and settled beside him with a contented rumble. One by one, the other Cubs joined them, creating a warm circle of golden fur and gentle breathing. Pip curled up against Bennett's chest, her tiny paws gripping his shirt as if to ensure he couldn't disappear. For the first time since his own family died in a transport accident years ago, Bennett felt truly at home, but he also felt something else: responsibility. These cubs had demonstrated capabilities that their own species didn't know existed. They had shown loyalty and intelligence that could change how the galaxy viewed the Althean people. The question was, what would the elders do when they learned that their failed cubs had not only bonded with a human, but had exceeded every expectation of their species' potential? Bennett looked down at the sleeping cubs and made a quiet promise. Whatever happened when they returned to the station, he would not let anyone separate this extraordinary family he had somehow managed to create. The cubs had chosen him, and he had chosen them. That was a bond that transcended species, politics, and ancient traditions. Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the revolution taking place aboard one small cargo freighter. But across the galaxy, monitoring stations were recording data that would soon shake the foundations of Althean society and force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their own children. Dr. Amy Collins had been studying alien psychology for 15 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the data streaming across her research station's monitors. The Althean cubs aboard Bennett's freighter were displaying brain activity patterns that shouldn't exist for another 6 months of development, minimum. The monitoring equipment Elder Thoric had secretly installed throughout the ship was transmitting continuous biometric data to her laboratory on Research Station Delta 7. What she was seeing challenged everything the scientific community believed about Althean neural development. Amy pushed her glasses up her nose and leaned closer to the displays. The cubs' prefrontal cortex activity was off the charts. Their pattern recognition scores exceeded adult baselines. Most remarkably, their stress hormone levels remained consistently lower than any recorded measurements from traditionally raised Althean children. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission from Elder Thoric. His massive golden face filled the communication screen, his expression grave with the weight of what they were both witnessing. Dr. Collins, I assume you have been monitoring the data streams? I have, Elder Thoric, and frankly I'm having trouble believing what I'm seeing. These cubs are developing cognitive abilities weeks ahead of schedule. Their problem-solving skills are remarkable. Thoric nodded slowly. The emergency situation 3 days ago provided us with unexpected insights. The cubs demonstrated tactical awareness and spatial intelligence that our best military academies spend years trying to develop in adult candidates. Amy pulled up the relevant footage on a secondary screen. She had watched it dozens of times, but it still amazed her. The cubs moving with purpose and coordination, protecting their human guardian, understanding complex systems they had never encountered before. Elder Thoric, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. How do Althean adults typically interact with unbonded cubs? The elder's golden eyes flickered with something that might have been discomfort. We follow the traditional protocols established by our ancestors. Firm guidance, clear hierarchy. The cubs must learn their place in the social structure. And physical contact? Minimal. Excessive contact can create dependency. Cubs must learn independence and strength. Amy felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. She'd been studying the psychological profiles of dozens of alien species, looking for commonalities in child-rearing practices. What she had discovered about human parenting might explain everything happening aboard Bennett's ship. Elder Thoric, I believe I know why your traditional methods have been failing with recent generations of cubs, and why they're thriving under human care. The elder leaned forward with intense interest. Explain. Amy activated her presentation software and began sharing her research. Human children require extensive physical contact, emotional validation, and protective behaviors from their caregivers. These needs are hardwired into our biology, because human infants are born completely helpless. We've evolved sophisticated parenting instincts to compensate. The screen showed brain scans comparing human and Althean neural development patterns. Your species evolved differently. Adult Altheans are incredibly strong and intelligent, capable of independence at a young age. Your traditional child rearing reflects this, emphasizing early self-reliance and emotional control. But here's what I think happened, Amy continued, highlighting specific data points. As Althean society became more technologically advanced, your cub's developmental needs changed. The skills required for modern civilization are different from those needed for survival on your ancestral homeworld. Thoric studied the data with growing comprehension. You are suggesting our own evolution has outpaced our cultural practices? Exactly. Your cubs need more complex neural stimulation now. They need emotional security to develop the cognitive flexibility required for advanced problem solving. Your traditional methods, which worked perfectly for thousands of years, are no longer optimal for the challenges your children will face. Amy switched to real-time biometric data from Bennett's ship. Look at these readings. The cubs are experiencing constant low-level stress under traditional care methods. That stress inhibits the neural pathways they need for higher cognitive development. But under human care, with increased physical contact, emotional validation, and protective behaviors, their stress levels drop dramatically, and their intelligence increases, Thoric concluded. Not just intelligence, emotional regulation, creativity, adaptive thinking, social coordination. Bennett isn't just keeping them alive, he's helping them become the best possible version of what an Althean can be. The implications hung in the air between them. If Amy's theory was correct, the Althean Confederacy had been accidentally suppressing their own children's potential for generations. The cubs weren't failing to bond with traditional guardians because they were defective. They were rejecting a care system that no longer met their developmental needs. Thoric was quiet for several long moments, processing the magnitude of what he was learning. Dr. Collins, if your theory is accurate, then we face a choice that will determine the future of our species. What do you mean? We can admit that our ancient ways are no longer sufficient and seek new methods of raising our young. Or we can reject these findings and watch our species slowly decline into extinction. Amy understood the weight of that choice. The Altheans were an incredibly proud species, one that valued tradition and cultural continuity above almost everything else. Admitting that humans, whom they considered primitive in many ways, could provide better care for Althean children would be devastating to their collective self-image. There might be a third option, Amy suggested carefully. Integration, combining the best of both approaches. Humans provide the emotional foundation and early bonding, while Althean adults handle advanced education and cultural instruction. A hybrid system. Thoric considered this possibility. It could work, but it would require unprecedented cooperation between our species, and it would still represent a fundamental challenge to our cultural identity. Before Amy could respond, her communication system chimed with an urgent priority message. The transmission was coming from Bennett's ship, and it wasn't part of the normal data stream. Amy accepted the connection, and Bennett's face appeared on screen alongside Elder. Thoric, the human, looked tired but determined, and behind him, Amy could see all 6 cubs gathered in what appeared to be a protective formation. Dr. Collins, Elder Thoric, we have a situation. Bennett began without preamble. I don't know what kind of monitoring you've been doing, but I know you've been watching us, and I think it's time we all had an honest conversation. Amy exchanged glances with Thoric. They had hoped to complete their research before revealing the extent of their surveillance, but Bennett was clearly more observant than they had anticipated. The cubs know they're being monitored, Bennett continued. They've figured out where your sensors are located and how they work. More importantly, they understand why you're watching. They know this is some kind of test. Pip stepped forward, into the camera's view, and made a series of complex vocalizations. Amy's translation software struggled with the rapid Althean speech, but the general meaning came through clearly. The cubs wanted to know what would happen to them when the test ended. They're asking if they'll be separated from you, Amy said quietly. Bennett's expression hardened with determination. That's not going to happen. These cubs have become my family, and I've become theirs. Whatever your data shows, whatever your scientific conclusions, nothing is going to change that. Max moved to Bennett's side and placed a protective paw on the human's shoulder. The gesture was unmistakably possessive, a clear declaration that the cubs had chosen their guardian and would not accept alternatives. Elder Thoric studied the scene with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of momentous decision. "Mr. Bennett, Dr. Collins, I believe the time for tests and observations has ended. What we are witnessing here represents nothing less than the evolution of our species' approach to child rearing. The question is no longer whether this unconventional arrangement works. The question is whether we have the wisdom to embrace change when it offers us hope for survival." Amy realized she was witnessing a turning point in galactic history. Two species, different in almost every way, had discovered that their survival might depend on learning from each other. The data on her screens told a story of remarkable success, but the real test would come when they had to convince an entire civilization to abandon traditions that had defined them for millennia. The cubs gathered closer around Bennett, and Amy could see in their eyes the intelligence and emotional depth that traditional Althean methods had never been able to nurture. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to the old ways. The future of the Althean species now depended on their willingness to accept that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting you need help. 10 years had passed since the day Bennett first took custody of 6 frightened Althean cubs, and the galaxy looked very different now. The same conference room where Elder Thoric had once argued with his peers now hosted representatives from 17 different species, all gathered to witness the graduation ceremony of the first class from the Integrated Guardian Academy. Bennett stood at the back of the room, his hair now completely silver and his face lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from years of laughter and worry in equal measure. Beside him, no longer cubs but young adults standing 7 feet tall, were his 6 children. They wore the deep blue ceremonial robes that marked them as the first generation of Althean human collaborative graduates. Pip, now called by her chosen adult name of Dr. Kira Bennett Thale, stepped forward to address the assembly. Her small stature as a cub had not predicted her eventual height, and she now commanded attention through presence rather than size. The intelligence that had shone in her green eyes as an infant had developed into something remarkable, earning her advanced degrees in both xenopsychology and interspecies communication. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of formal Althean speech combined with the warmth that humans had taught her to express. "We gather today, not just to celebrate academic achievement, but to acknowledge a fundamental shift in how we understand the development of intelligent life." The audience included Elder Thoric, now bearing the ceremonial braids of the High Council chairman, alongside human diplomats, Valerian trade representatives, and even the notoriously isolationist Crystalline Collective. What had started as a desperate experiment to save 6 cubs had grown into the galaxy's most successful model for interspecies cooperation. Max, who had chosen the adult name Commander Dex Bennett Kohler, stood beside his sister. His military bearing and tactical brilliance had earned him a position in the newly formed Confederacy Defense Corps, where mixed-species crews were proving remarkably effective at complex problem-solving and conflict resolution. "The old ways taught us that strength comes from independence," Dex continued where Kira left off. "The new ways have shown us that true strength comes from connection, understanding, and the willingness to learn from those who are different from ourselves." The ceremony was interrupted by a soft, chiming sound. Elder Thoric rose from his seat and approached the podium with the careful dignity that age and wisdom had granted him. His golden mane was now streaked with silver, and his eyes held the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see his greatest gamble pay off beyond his wildest hopes. "Before we continue with the formal proceedings," Thoric announced, "I must share news that arrived just this morning. The Outer Rim colonies have reported the successful bonding of 43 cubs with human guardians over the past year. The success rate now stands at 97%, compared to the 12% success rate we achieved using traditional methods." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the assembly. Dr. Amy Collins, now Director of Interspecies Developmental Studies, stood and added her own update. "The psychological profiles of cubs raised in integrated households show remarkable improvements across all measured categories. Enhanced problem-solving abilities, superior emotional regulation, advanced communication skills, and most importantly, a 60% increase in creative thinking compared to previous generations. Bennett felt a gentle touch on his shoulder and turned to see Pip approaching him. Even as an adult, she still sought his approval and comfort in moments of significance. Some things, he reflected, transcended species boundaries and never changed. "Dad," she said quietly, using the human term that had become standard among integrated families. "Are you ready for the surprise?" Bennett raised an eyebrow. His children had inherited the Althean love of elaborate planning, and their surprises tended to be complex affairs involving multiple star systems and carefully coordinated timing. The lights in the conference room dimmed, and a massive holographic display activated above the assembly. Images began flowing across the projection, showing scenes from across the galaxy. Althean cubs playing with human children on colony worlds, mixed species families exploring ancient ruins together, teenagers of different races working side by side in research laboratories and engineering workshops. "The Guardian program has expanded beyond our original vision," announced Leo Bennett Kane, the fourth of Bennett's cubs, who had become a leading architect of interspecies social policy. "We now have integrated families on 47 worlds, representing 12 different species combinations." The images continued, showing the remarkable diversity that had emerged from that first desperate experiment. Human families raising Valerian, crystal singers, teaching them emotional expression through music. Althean adults mentoring human children in advanced mathematics and strategic thinking. Crystalline collective entities learning the value of physical affection from mammalian species. Zoe Bennett Mira, the fifth cub, stepped forward with the precise movements that had made her a renowned diplomat. But perhaps the most significant development has been the emergence of what we call cultural hybrid vigor. The children raised in integrated households consistently outperform their single-species peers in creativity, adaptability, and cross-cultural communication. The sixth cub, Dr. Ben Bennett Solar, who had taken his guardian's name as his own honor, added the final piece of their presentation. "We have documented the emergence of entirely new art forms, scientific approaches, and philosophical frameworks that could only have developed through interspecies collaboration. The children are creating culture that belongs to no single race but to all of us together." Bennett felt tears forming in his eyes as he watched the holographic display. What had started as 6 frightened cubs in his cargo bay had become a galactic movement that was reshaping civilization itself. The fear, the uncertainty, the sleepless nights worried about whether he was doing the right thing. It had all led to this moment of triumph. Elder Thoric approached the podium one final time. "There are those among our people who still resist these changes. They argue that we are losing our cultural identity, that we are becoming something other than pure Althean. To them I say this: we are not becoming less than what we were. We are becoming more than we ever imagined possible." He gestured toward Bennett and the 6 graduates. "This human showed us that love transcends species, that the desire to protect and nurture the young is universal among intelligent beings, that sometimes the greatest act of cultural preservation is the willingness to adapt and grow." The formal ceremony continued with the presentation of credentials and the recitation of oaths, but for Bennett, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when the official proceedings had ended and the delegates had dispersed to their various receptions and meetings. His 6 children gathered around him in the same protective circle they had formed as cubs, but now they towered over him with their full adult height. The physical dynamic had changed, but the emotional bond remained as strong as ever. "So what's next for the old man?" Bennett asked with a smile. "I'm not sure I'm ready to retire from active duty." Kira exchanged glances with her siblings before responding. "Actually, Dad, we've been hoping you'd consider a new assignment. The Rigel system has reported some unusual developments with their cubs. They're requesting a consultation from the original Guardian team." Bennett looked around at his children, seeing the mixture of hope and anticipation in their expressions. They had grown beyond his ability to guide them in many ways, becoming leaders and innovators in their own right. but they still wanted him to be part of their adventures. "Another rescue mission?" he asked. "Another family to build," Max replied with the tactical precision that defined his personality. Bennett nodded slowly, feeling the familiar stirring of excitement that came with new challenges and new possibilities. "Well then, I suppose we'd better get the ship ready for departure." As they walked together through the corridors of the station, Bennett reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. A desperate elder's gamble had become the foundation for a new kind of civilization, one built on the revolutionary idea that differences between species could be sources of strength rather than division. The future stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and unlimited possibilities. There would be more cubs who needed families, more species learning to trust each other, more barriers to break down, and more bridges to build. But whatever came next, Bennett knew they would face it together. 6 cubs had taught one human that family wasn't about biology or species or ancient traditions. It was about choosing to love, to protect, and to grow together, despite every logical reason why it shouldn't work. And that choice, repeated across the galaxy by thousands of integrated families, was writing a new chapter in the story of what intelligent life could become when it dared to reach across the vast spaces between species and discover that love, after all, was the most universal force in the universe. The stars waited, patient and eternal, as another generation prepared to explore the infinite possibilities that opened when different worlds chose to become one family.